The heavy oak doors of the Oakhaven Royal Conservatory groaned open, allowing a blast of biting December wind to slice through the perfumed warmth of the grand hall. In that fleeting moment, two completely different worlds collided. Inside, there was the golden glow of crystal chandeliers, the scent of mulled wine, and the polite laughter of Boston's elite. Outside, there was only the merciless winter and the struggle to survive. And standing right on the threshold, shivering in a threadbare gray hoodie that offered no protection against the cold, was 15-year-old Leo Barnes. He took a hesitant step forward, his battered sneakers leaving a trail of dark, wet footprints on the pristine Italian marble floor. Leo didn't know it yet, but those dirty footprints were about to lead him toward a destiny that no money could buy and a confrontation that would leave every wealthy patron in that room breathless. The burly security guard stationed at the entrance of the Oakhaven Royal Conservatory didn't even blink as he raised a gloved hand, blocking the path. "Service entrance is around the back, kid. Deliveries don't come through the grand foyer." Leo Barnes froze, the biting Boston wind whipping against his thin, gray hoodie. Beside him, Mr. Henry straightened his spine. Though his tweed coat was frayed at the elbows and smelled faintly of old sheet music and mothballs, the 65-year-old music teacher carried himself with a dignity that commanded attention. "We are not here for a delivery," Mr. Henry said, his voice calm but firm. He reached into his pocket and produced a cream-colored envelope with gold embossing. "We are guests of board member Higgins. This is Leo Barnes, my student." The guard frowned, scanning the invitation with suspicion before grudgingly stepping aside. "Wipe your feet," he grunted. Leo stepped across the threshold, and the world shifted instantly. The biting cold of the winter night was replaced by a wave of perfumed warmth that smelled of cinnamon, roasted chestnuts, and expensive cologne. The grand hall was more magnificent than anything Leo had ever seen in his 15 years of life in the crumbling tenements of the city. A 12-foot Douglas fir tree dominated the corner, dripping with real crystal ornaments that caught the light of the massive chandeliers above. He felt acutely aware of his own appearance. Among the sea of black tuxedos and shimmering evening gowns, his faded jeans and worn-out sneakers looked like a stain on a masterpiece. He tried to wipe his shoes on the plush rug, but as he walked onto the gleaming Italian marble, he couldn't help but leave faint, wet tracks of slush behind him. He kept his head down, wishing he could dissolve into the floor. "Chin up, Leo," Mr. Henry whispered, leaning closer. "You belong where the music is. Never forget that." And then Leo saw it. In the center of the room, raised on a low velvet-covered dais, stood the heart of the gala, a 9-foot Steinway & Sons Model D concert grand piano. It was a beast of polished ebony, its lid raised like the wing of a black swan ready to take flight. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. It was the most expensive thing Leo had ever looked at, and it pulled at him with a magnetic force that made his fingers twitch in his pockets. "Stay right here," Mr. Henry said, patting Leo's shoulder. "I see Mr. Higgins by the fireplace. I'll just go pay my respects and bring him over to meet you. Don't wander off." Leo nodded, watching his only lifeline disappear into the throng of laughing, drinking socialites. Suddenly, he was alone. A waiter carrying a silver tray of champagne flutes swerved to avoid him, casting a look of undisguised annoyance. The crowd seemed to swell, pushing Leo closer and closer to the center of the room, leaving him stranded like a piece of driftwood in a golden ocean. He stood frozen near the dais, his eyes locked on the piano's ivory keys, imagining how cold and smooth they would feel beneath his calloused fingertips. He was so lost in the imaginary melody playing in his head that he didn't notice the conversation nearby die down. A high-pitched, piercing voice cut through the hum of the party, sharp enough to shatter glass. "Oh my God, where is security?" The voice rang out, dripping with exaggerated shock. "Why is the delivery boy dirtying the floor in the middle of the gala?" Leo spun around, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, revealing the owner of the piercing voice. Standing there was a girl who looked like she had stepped straight out of a magazine cover. Julia Sterling was perhaps 16, draped in a crimson evening gown that shimmered under the chandelier lights like liquid ruby. A diamond necklace, delicate yet undeniably expensive, rested against her throat. She was breathtakingly beautiful, But as her ice-blue eyes bore into Leo, he saw nothing but cold, sharp cruelty. She wasn't looking at his face. She was pointing a manicured finger at the floor. "Look at this," Julia announced, her voice carrying an air of performative distress that drew the attention of everyone nearby. "He's tracking mud all over the Italian marble. It's absolutely filthy." Leo instinctively looked down. The slush from his worn-out sneakers had melted, creating a small, dark puddle on the pristine white stone. The heat of shame rushed up his neck, burning his ears. I'm sorry," Leo stammered, his voice cracking. He tried to wipe the sole of his shoe against his pant leg, a futile gesture that only made him look more desperate. "I tried to clean them at the door." "You tried?" Julia let out a short, incredulous laugh that was echoed by the small entourage of teenagers standing behind her, boys in silk ties and girls in velvet, who looked at Leo as if he were a specimen in a jar. "What are you even doing here? Did you get lost on your way to the service entrance?" The kitchen staff enters through the alley, not the grand foyer. "I'm not staff," Leo said, forcing himself to meet her gaze, though his knees felt weak. "I'm a guest." "My teacher." He was invited. "A guest." Julia repeated the word as if it tasted sour. She took a step closer, invading his personal space. The scent of her expensive perfume, something sweet and overwhelming, filled Leo's nose. "Let me guess. You're a charity case. Someone thought it would be noble to let the street kid see how the other half lives for a night. Is that it?" The circle of onlookers tightened. No one stepped in. No one defended him. They just watched, sipping their champagne, entertained by the spectacle of the wealthy heiress dressing down the intruder. Leo felt the walls closing in. He needed to get away. He needed to find Mr. Henry. He took a stumbling step backward, desperate to retreat from Julia's accusatory glare. But in his panic, he misjudged the distance. His heel caught the edge of the velvet dais. Leo flailed, losing his balance. To stop himself from falling, he threw his hands out blindly. Thud. His palms landed squarely on the polished ebony lid of the Steinway Concert Grand. The sound was dull, barely audible over the chatter, but to Julia, it might as well have been a gunshot. "Get away from that!" Julia shrieked, the veneer of polite society dropping instantly. She lunged forward as if Leo had just pressed a burning brand against the instrument. Leo recoiled, snatching his hands back as if the piano had burned him, but the damage was done in Julia's eyes, at least. Two faint, cloudy handprints marred the perfect, mirror-like finish of the piano's lid. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" Julia's voice dropped to a lethal hiss, silencing the immediate area. The background chatter died out. The clinking of glasses stopped. Even the string quartet in the corner seemed to hesitate. Julia stepped onto the dais, towering over Leo as he cowered by the piano bench. She looked at his hands, rough, calloused, with fingernails cut short, and then at the magnificent instrument. The disgust on her face was absolute. "That is a Steinway Model D." She spat the words out, leaning in so close that Leo could see the flecks of gold in her furious eyes. "It is not a toy. It is not a counter for you to lean on. And it certainly isn't something to be touched by dirty hands that have probably never held anything more valuable than a broom." Leo stood frozen, trapped between the piano and the girl who seemed determined to crush him. He opened his mouth to apologize again, but she cut him off with a glare that froze the words in his throat. "Don't you dare speak," she whispered, the threat hanging heavy in the silent hall. "And don't you ever touch what you can't afford. That piano is worth more than your entire life." Julia's whisper hung in the air like a guillotine blade waiting to drop, but the silence didn't last long. The sudden commotion had acted like a beacon, drawing the most powerful figure in the room. The crowd of onlookers parted swiftly, heads bowing in deference as an elegant older woman with silver hair swept into a chignon approached. It was Mrs. Eleanor Vance, the headmistress of Oakhaven. Draped in midnight blue velvet, she moved with the silent authority of a queen inspecting her court. "What is the meaning of this disturbance?" Mrs. Vance asked, her voice low but carrying an edge that could cut steel. Julia immediately transformed. The cruel snarl vanished from her lips, replaced by a mask of wide-eyed concern. She pointed a trembling finger at Leo. "Mrs. Vance, thank goodness you're here. This This boy almost knocked over the Steinway. I caught him trying to pry the lid open. I think he was trying to damage it, or worse. A collective gasp rippled through the gathered socialites. Damaging a Steinway was a cardinal sin in this temple of music. Mrs. Vance turned her gaze toward Leo. Her expression wasn't angry, but it was dangerously cold, the look one gives to a stain that needs removing. "Is this true?" she asked. "No." A breathless voice shouted from the edge of the circle. Mr. Henry burst through the wall of tuxedos, his face flushed, his breathing ragged. He placed a protective hand on Leo's shoulder, shielding the boy from the judgmental glares. "Eleanor." "Mrs. Vance." "That is a lie. Leo is my student. He respects instruments more than anyone in this room." Mrs. Vance arched a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "Mr. Henry, I was surprised to see your name on the guest list. I assumed you knew better than to bring untrained visitors to the winter gala." She glanced at Leo's hoodie, her nose wrinkling slightly. "Perhaps it is best if you escort him out, before security is involved." Leo felt his heart sink. It was over. The verdict had been delivered without a trial. He turned to leave, head bowed, ready to retreat back into the cold where he belonged. "Wait." Julia's voice stopped them. She wasn't satisfied with a quiet exit. She wanted a spectacle. She wanted total victory. "Mr. Henry called him a student," Julia said, a cruel smile playing on her lips as she fingered the diamond necklace at her throat. "He claims this boy respects the instrument. Well, if he's a musician, surely he can play, can't he?" She stepped forward, turning the interrogation into a show for the audience. "I have a proposition. Mr. Henry claims this boy is talented. I say he's a vandal. Let's settle it." Julia unclasped the diamond necklace from her neck. The gems caught the chandelier light, scattering rainbows across the room. She held it up, dangling it like bait. "If he can sit at that bench and play one single classical piece that doesn't sound like a dying cat," Julia announced, her voice ringing with arrogance, "I will personally apologize and give him this necklace. It's worth more than his entire neighborhood." The crowd murmured in shock. It was an outrageous bet. But, Julia continued, her eyes locking onto Leo's, dark and predatory, "If he fails, if he wastes our time, then you have security throw him out into the snow. And ban him from Oakhaven forever." "Julia, that is enough," Mrs. Vance warned, though she looked intrigued. "Why not, headmistress?" Julia challenged. "Oakhaven is for the elite. If he belongs, let him prove it. Or are you afraid he'll dirty the keys?" The challenge hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. All eyes turned to Leo. He looked at Mr. Henry, seeing the fear in his teacher's eyes. Then he looked at Julia, standing there with her diamonds and her disdain. Something inside Leo snapped, not broken, but set into place. The fear of humiliation was suddenly outweighed by a burning need to speak the only language he knew fluently. Leo stepped out from under Mr. Henry's arm. He looked straight at Mrs. Vance. "I'll play," he said. His voice was quiet, but it didn't shake. Mrs. Vance studied him for a long, tense moment. She saw the fraying threads of his hoodie, the dirt on his shoes, but she also saw something in his eyes of fire that she rarely saw in her wealthy students. "Very well," Mrs. Vance nodded slowly. "One chance, young man. Do not make me regret this." Leo walked toward the dais. The distance was only 10 feet, but it felt like walking a mile across a tightrope. He climbed the step and sat on the plush leather bench. It was soft, expensive. He reached out and placed his hands on the keys. They were cold, pristine ivory. He closed his eyes, shutting out the glares, the diamonds, the judgment. He could feel Julia's smirk burning into his back, waiting for him to fail. He took a deep, shuddering breath, his fingers hovering over the keys, trembling with the weight of the storm he was about to unleash. Leo closed his eyes. For a fleeting second, the scent of the polished ebony would fill his lungs, smelling like a forest after rain. He blocked out the scent of expensive perfume, the murmur of the crowd, and the burning gaze of Julia Sterling. In the darkness behind his eyelids, he wasn't a charity case. He wasn't a stain on the marble floor. He was a storm waiting to break. He didn't start tentatively. He didn't test the waters. Leo raised his hands and brought them down with the force of a thunderclap. The first chord of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, Third movement, presto agitato, exploded from the instrument. It wasn't the gentle, melancholic moonlight that amateur pianists often played. This was the hurricane. It was a ferocious, lightning-fast ascent of arpeggios that required fingers of steel and a soul on fire. The sound hit the room like a physical wave. Gasps erupted from the front row, but they were instantly swallowed by the torrent of notes pouring from the piano. Leo's fingers were a blur, moving with a speed that defied logic. The callous tips that Julia had mocked the hands that swept floors and carried groceries were now dancing across the ivory with a precision that was terrifying to behold. He played with a ferocity that bordered on violence. Every sharp accent was a shout of frustration against the cold winters without heat. Every rapid run was a sprint away from the hunger that gnawed at his belly. He wasn't just playing Beethoven. He was channeling 15 years of silence, of being looked through, of being told he didn't matter. Julia's smirk didn't just fade, it shattered. Her mouth fell open, her face draining of color until she looked as pale as her diamond necklace. The glass of champagne in her hand tilted dangerously, forgotten. She watched, paralyzed, as the boy she had called a delivery boy commanded the Steinway like a king on his throne. Sweat beaded on Leo's forehead. His gray hoodie bunched around his shoulders as his body swayed with the violent rhythm of the music. He was completely lost in a zone, a place where money didn't exist, where status didn't matter, where the only currency was raw emotion. The piano roared under his touch, responding to his hunger with a voice that filled every corner of the grand hall, shaking the crystal ornaments on the Christmas tree. Mrs. Vance took a step forward, her hand rising to cover her mouth. She had heard this piece played by world-renowned virtuosos, technically perfect and polished. But she had never heard it played like this. This wasn't a performance. It was a confession. As Leo reached the coda, the final, tumultuous conclusion of the piece, his intensity peaked. He hammered the final chords with everything he had left, pouring his entire soul into the instrument until the last note rang out, hanging in the air with the weight of a judgment delivered. Leo slumped forward, his chest heaving, his hands trembling as they rested on his knees. He was exhausted, drained, but for the first time in his life, he felt full. 4-3 heartbeats. There was absolute silence. No one moved. No one breathed. The shock was absolute. Then, a single pair of hands started to clap. It was Mr. Henry. Then another. Then 10. Then the whole room erupted. It wasn't polite applause. It was a roar of astonishment. But before Leo could even lift his head to see the reaction, a shrill scream cut through the thunderous ovation. "Stop! Stop clapping!" Julia pushed her way to the front, her face twisted in a mix of humiliation and panic. She looked frantic, like an animal cornered. "He's a fraud," she shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at Leo. "Don't you see? He's a scammer." Julia's scream sliced through the applause like a knife, silencing the room instantly. She marched to the center of the floor, her face flushed a blotchy red, her composure completely unraveled. "He's a fraud," she shouted, pointing a shaking finger at Leo, who was still catching his breath on the piano bench. "Don't be fooled. He learned that one song. Just one. He probably memorized the finger movements from a YouTube video like a circus monkey. That's not talent. That's a trick." The murmurs returned. Doubt rippled through the crowd. It was a plausible accusation. After all, how could a boy in a dirty hoodie play Beethoven with such mastery without years of expensive lessons? Mrs. Vance frowned, looking between the hysterical girl and the silent boy. "Julia, be careful with your words," she warned. "Test him," Julia pleaded, desperation creeping into her voice. "Give him something he's never heard before. I bet he can't read a single note of sheet music." Leo looked up, his eyes weary. "She's right," he said softly, his voice barely audible in the cavernous hall. I can't read sheet music very well." A collective sigh of disappointment swept through the room. Julia let out a triumphant laugh. "See? I told you. He's a fake." However, a deep, resonant voice interrupted. A distinguished man in a tweed suit stepped forward from the shadows near the Christmas tree. It was Professor Marcus Reed, the renowned head of piano studies at Oak Haven. He adjusted his gold-rimmed glasses, his eyes fixed on Leo with intense curiosity. "Reading music is a skill, Miss Sterling," Professor Reed said calmly. "But musicality, that is a gift." He walked over to the piano and looked at Leo. "May I?" Leo slid over on the bench, making room. Professor Reed sat down. "I'm going to play something I just composed in my head," Reed whispered to Leo, excluding the rest of the room. "It has no sheet music. It has never been recorded. If you are what I think you are, you won't need your eyes." Reed raised his hands and began to play. It was a chaotic, complex improvisation, a fusion of dissonant jazz chords and rapid classical scales. It was erratic, unpredictable, and deliberately difficult, full of sudden tempo changes and odd intervals that would trip up even a seasoned professional. He played for a full minute, weaving a sonic tapestry that was impossible to memorize by rote. When he finished, the room was dead silent. Reed stood up and gestured to the keys. "Your turn." Julia crossed her arms, a smug smile returning to her lips. "Impossible," she muttered. "Nobody can." Leo didn't hesitate. He didn't look at the keys. He looked into the middle distance, his head tilted slightly as if listening to an echo that only he could hear. Then his hands moved. He played. Not only did he play the exact same chaotic sequence of notes that Professor Reed had just invented, but he played them with the exact same timing, the same pressure, the same dynamic shifts. He replicated the impossible improvisation note for note, as if he were a human tape recorder. But then Leo did something else. In the final measure, instead of ending abruptly as Reed had, Leo added a soft, resolving chord, a perfect musical period to the professor's unfinished sentence. He lifted his hands. Professor Reed stared at the boy, his mouth slightly agape. He looked at Mrs. Vance, then back at Leo, shaking his head in disbelief. "Absolute pitch," Reed whispered, but in the silence, it sounded like a shout. "He has perfect pitch. I haven't seen ears like this since I studied at Vienna." He turned to the crowd, his voice booming. "This boy isn't a fraud. He is a prodigy. He is Mozart reborn." Crush. The sound of shattering glass punctuated the professor's verdict. Julia Sterling stood frozen, her hand empty, the champagne flute she had been holding now a pile of sparkling shards around her expensive heels. Her face was a mask of pure, devastating shock. The silence that followed Professor Reed's declaration was profound, but this time, it wasn't born of judgment. It was the silence of reverence. Then, slowly, the applause began again. It started with Mrs. Vance, clapping her gloved hands with deliberate respect, and soon the entire grand hall was filled with a warm, thunderous ovation. It wasn't the polite clapping of a gala. It was the heartfelt tribute to undeniable greatness. Mrs. Vance stepped over the shattered remains of Julia's champagne flute, ignoring the mess, and placed a firm hand on Leo's shoulder. She looked at the crowd, her voice ringing out clear and authoritative. "Oakhaven was built to house the finest musicians in the world," she announced. "Tonight, we almost let one slip through our fingers because of a pair of shoes." She turned to Leo, her expression softening. "Mr. Barnes, if you are willing, I am offering you a full, comprehensive scholarship to the conservatory, effective immediately. We need artists here, not just mannequins." Leo felt a lump form in his throat. He looked toward the entrance, where a woman in a worn winter coat had just rushed in, her face wet with tears. It was his mother. She had missed the bus and run 6 blocks in the snow, but she had arrived just in time to see her son crowned a king. But the night wasn't over. The crowd parted as Julia Sterling stepped forward. She looked smaller now, stripped of her arrogance. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed. Her friends had quietly disappeared, leaving her to face the music alone. With trembling hands, she reached up and unclasped the diamond necklace from her throat, the very necklace she had wagered in her arrogance. The diamonds sparkled fiercely under the chandelier lights, worth more money than Leo's mother could earn in 10 years. Julia held it out, her head bowed. I lost," she whispered, her voice cracking. "A bet is a bet. Take it." The room held its breath. Everyone expected Leo to snatch the prize. It was his right. It was his payback. Leo looked at the dazzling jewels dangling from Julia's manicured fingers. Then, he looked down at his own hands, rough, scarred, and still dusty from the day's work. He thought about the cold winters, the hunger, and the insults. He could take the necklace. He could sell it. He could buy 1,000 pairs of new shoes. But then he looked at his mother, standing proud in her old coat. Leo reached out and gently pushed Julia's hand back toward her chest. "Keep it, Julia," Leo said. His voice was calm, carrying a dignity that no amount of money could purchase. "I don't need diamonds to shine. My value isn't in what I wear around my neck, but in what I create with these hands." Julia looked up, stunned. Tears finally spilled over her lashes, not from humiliation this time, but from a shame that burned deeper than anger. She nodded slowly, clutching the necklace to her chest as if it were a burden she now had to carry. Leo turned away. He walked off the dais, past the stunned socialites, and straight into his mother's open arms. As they hugged, the warmth of their embrace seemed to fill the room more than the fireplace ever could. Together, they walked back toward the heavy oak doors. As they stepped out into the night, the snow had stopped falling. The storm had passed, leaving behind a clear, star-filled sky that lit their path home. Behind them, the grand hall remained silent, forever changed by the boy who touched the piano and left a mark on their souls. Leo walked out into the winter night not with a diamond in his hand, but with something far more precious, the quiet strength of his own dignity. His story reminds us that true nobility isn't found in the price tag of our clothes, but in the courage to let our God-given talents speak louder than the judgments of others. So the next time you see someone standing in the cold, remember to look past the rough exterior, for a kind heart and a gifted soul are the only jewels that never lose their shine.